Welcome to the AlexMercedCast, where Alex Merced of AlexMerced.com brings you principled, thoughtful, libertarian commentary on issues that matter.
Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from AlexMerced.com, and you're listening to the Alex MercedCast, which you can subscribe to on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher. Now, what I want to talk about today, basically, is I wanted to reflect on a recent debate by fellow LNC member Joshua Smith, representing anarcho-capitalism versus Mike Shipley, representing the libertarian socialist position. And overall, the debate, if you want, go watch it. It was on the Anarcho Redneck Facebook page. And it's an enjoyable debate, especially if you really get into sort of the weeds of sort of libertarian thought. But basically, they kind of sum up the two debates. Basically, Josh Smith is basically arguing that there has to be a sort of fairly properly definitive set of basically barriers of property rights in order for any kind of economic system to exist in a voluntary world. So that's sort of where Josh was coming back. So basically coming from the sense that you can have the non-aggression principle, but the non-aggression principle hinges on us knowing what your life, body, and property are. So while it's pretty clear what your life and body are, what your property is has to be well defined, so that way you can apply the NAP. That's sort of the argument he was making, and basically saying, so when other people are trying to come up with sort of alternate definitions of property, it sort of distorts how the NAP applies, and distorts, in a way he finds disingenuous, what libertarianism is, in the sense that by redefining property, you can then suddenly argue that initiations or the use of force can be appropriate in places that people with more traditional views of property might not find. And this is often sort of a reflection on those who call themselves libertarian socialists. And again, there's a group called the Libertarian Socialist Caucus of the Libertarian Party, which, to be fair, is really an organization that at least their stated purpose is to be sort of a home for the libertarian left, which includes like Georgists, voluntarists, and again, not all voluntarists, particular voluntarists, because voluntarists can go in either direction. Just point is, the whole world is voluntary. And if I know my history correctly, originally it was referred to as the Black Flag Caucus. And then among its members, many of the members ended up voting in to be called the Libertarian Socialist Caucus for the purposes of being provocative, which, from a marketing purpose, has worked. When they were the Black Flag Caucus, no one noticed them. And once it became the Libertarian Socialist Caucus, that term socialist caused so much controversy, caused so much reaction, that it got them a lot more attention, and that did lead to them growing larger. But the views, as articulated by many of its members, I have heard quite variety of views, and I've heard disagreement among its members. So I don't want to necessarily paint the full organization as a broad brush. I'm not necessarily a big fan of the word socialism, and I do understand Josh's concerns with how, if you get disingenuous about how you define property rights, you can then sort of start attributing things that are sort of beyond sort of really what, at least, people will sit there and say, okay, well, when the word libertarian first started, it was socialist. Yes, terms change, definitions in time, but libertarians, as it's understood in the American political context nowadays, generally does kind of assume a sort of Lockean proviso as far as its way determines property rights, meaning, homesteading, mixing labor and property and all that stuff, okay? So I agree with that. You need to kind of have that strong foundation in property rights. Now, Mike Shipley, on the other hand, was just basically arguing. His argument was that his views on libertarian socialism. So again, the Libertarian Socialist Caucus can be very diverse, and some of its members can make statements that are more controversial to most libertarians than others. I'm not gonna name names or point out the particular statements, because that's not my point in this episode. My real point in this episode is really to talk about horizontal versus vertical enterprise. But I gotta frame the debate so you guys can understand where this is coming from. Is that Mike Shipley's point was, yes, that's right. Property, there is a defined property. At least in Shipley's eyes, he agrees with sort of the traditional sort of libertarian view in property, where there is resources, and basically if you mix your labor with resources, that is yours. So a house that you build is yours, whatnot. Where he did differ, which is sort of a George's thing, is that you don't own the land. You can't own the land. So even if you can build a fence on the land, and the fence is yours, but the land itself isn't yours because you didn't make the land. So this is sort of an argument that a lot of Georgists make, and this is sort of how they kind of make the argument for a land tax as sort of the only justifiable tax, because I don't want to get knee deep into Georgism because it's not something that I would consider myself an expert in, but the basic idea is, the value of the land is taxable because it's not really yours. But the things like, let's say, the value of your house, the improvements you make on the land are yours because you've improved the land, so the house you built on it is yours. And basically, you can tax the value of the land, but not the value of the improvements. So if your property is worth $300,000 and $100,000 of it is because of the value of the land, figured out in some magical way, you can tax that value. So that's sort of that argument, although the land value tax was not part of this particular discussion. But that's generally when you hear like that whole, like, you don't own the land, but the improvements on the land, that's kind of where generally that conversation tends to go. Now, but basically, so Shipley agreed with sort of the law in that sense of mixing labor with property, defines property claims and whatnot, which is generally the libertarian framework for property ownership. You have to have some sort of justifiable claim, whether if it was talking about something that was unclaimed, you mix your labor with it, and if it's something that already had a claim on it, that person voluntarily giving up the claim to you through some sort of exchange. Okay, so that's how property comes into existence and how it transfers ownership within sort of a libertarian framework. So basically, again, this is the way Shipley articulated it. Basically, he was arguing that within the current system, because the state has so many different policies that make things more expensive than they otherwise be, or limit people's use of property, or limit access to property, that certain property claims can be just, unjust, or certain situations are exploitive. And you can make that argument. Again, a social critique of again, you can critique an economic system and say certain things are unjust or bad or undesirable, and not necessarily say, hey, I think the use of force should be used to solve that problem. So, the social criticisms are that, and those are generally more, again, socialist type criticisms. Okay, generally like socialist communist literature generally focuses on the whole idea of behind like exploitation and whatnot. Okay, and that's sort of basically saying that the business owners make a disproportionate share of the profits of an industry, while the workers are being exploited because they're only getting such a small or defined portion of the value of the labor. Sort of the counter argument, this is the stuff that Eugen von Bachwerk said and whatnot, was that labor chooses to get paid earlier in the process. So if labor said, hey, you know what, we'll wait till everything gets sold and we'll split up the profits at the end, that's one story. But the thing is that labor says, hey, we want to get paid up front, regardless of whether you're able to sell the good or don't sell the good. We want this sort of set payment. So by taking less risk and taking money earlier, and again, time, there's that whole relation to interest. and risk, the whole relationship between risk and reward, they end up, that those explain why they get a smaller portion of the resulting production. Okay, and also it's just a voluntary arrangement. So you can go back to like Eugen von Bauwerk, and I'm not sure, did Karl Menger have something to say about that? No, but I know Eugen von Bauwerk for sure had a lot to say on this particular issue of time and interest and labor and whatnot, criticizing sort of the Marxist sort of definition or this whole idea of exploitation. Okay, but that's kind of where Shipley was coming from, just talking about like this exploitation and saying, this exploitation would be less if everyone shared. Okay, you'd have a much more sort of egalitarian system, because when you have one person who disproportionately can share and can decide to fire people, they have a sort of implicit control over others that he finds problematic. So the desirability for more horizontal ways of enterprise, these are like what a lot of sort of modern day Marxist communists whatnot push for, because a lot of at least people who are more familiar with, or studied this stuff and a little bit more familiar, there are a lot of Marxists and communists have accepted a lot of the criticisms of like Mises with the calculation problem, or the incentive problems that other people debated, and a lot of these things I'm pointing out right now. So a lot of modern day communist Marxist thought aren't necessarily no longer are anti-market in the sense that there shouldn't be any kind of exchange or free exchange. They now focus a lot more in the design of the enterprise. So now they're more focused on saying, hey, people can start businesses, but the businesses should be worker-owned, in the sense that the people who work the business, or everything should be a co-op, whether it's a consumer co-op or a worker co-op, but that, by having more people be involved in the decision-making and not just how they run the business, it'll result in fair wages and a more fair distribution of profits and all that stuff. And that's a thing. And that's possibly a thing. There are that, well, before I get into like sort of the efficacy of horizontal versus vertical enterprises, the point is like that's sort of where that conversation was going. Okay, and both of them just basically, for the most part, that whole debate kept restating their point, and the debate itself, basically, from what I could read in the comments, basically, if you supported one side versus the other, you just basically felt that person dominated the debate and the other person didn't make any sense. Hopefully, I faithfully restated both of their arguments in a way that helps you understand where they were coming from. But basically, the conclusion was that they both don't want to exercise force. Shipley does want a more sort of egalitarian economic system, but he wants it to occur through advocacy and getting people to sort of buy into it and want to participate in it. And he does sort of believe in sort of a more Lockean type, property type system, in the sense that, again, what we discussed earlier. So that was that. But basically, what I saw in a lot of the debates, people just sort of dismiss the efficacy of a horizontal enterprise. Now, again, enterprises evolve. Enterprises have been evolving over time. I mean, you had much more the stricter rule. But, even nowadays, you have a lot less defined hierarchies in enterprise, where basically, it's not just pure straight lines where someone's always the boss of somebody else. You are starting to see enterprises structured more in teams, and they're moving in more collaborative directions. And there's reasons for that. Basically, in the past, and there's different reasons why you would try different types of or ways of arranging a business, of arranging decision making. This is why I find the field of sort of corporate governance, the academic study of it, and the work of institutional economists, new institutional economists, Austrian economists that are focused on institutions, kind of like a Peter Klein, why I find their work really interesting, because there's actually, there are a lot of differences in the way you set stuff up. So depending on who's in charge, how are they in charge, how you set up structures of relative power, it can really change that, and it can be more effective in achieving certain goals versus other goals, and really kind of determine how certain people interact with each other. Okay. Now, the reason why you're starting to see a lot more collaboration and a lot more collaborative efforts in enterprise nowadays is because we're moving into an era where creativity matters more, and creative problem solving and creativity is just a lot more valuable nowadays. So you need people to feel comfortable bouncing ideas off each other. So having teams where there isn't necessarily as clear this person is above you kind of thing makes it easier for people to sort of share ideas. Vice versa, when you have like a clear, everyone is above someone else or below someone else, sometimes people aren't as clear to share ideas, because you don't necessarily want to share your good ideas with someone below you because you're scared that they'll use them to climb above you. You don't want to share with the people above you because they have the power to fire you if you don't let them take credit for your idea. So the exchange of ideas sometimes isn't always the best. But it's great for like places where creativity isn't the issue. The issue is sort of, everyone doing a very specific task. You need someone who can clearly sort of put their foot down if someone isn't completing a task, and having a chain of sort of accountability. So there are certain situations from a governance standpoint and achieving institutional goals standpoint where, horizontal versus vertical, meaning horizontal meaning someone's in charge of someone, versus horizontal versus everyone kind of works together, type systems work. Now, the challenge is one thing is creating a horizontally or vertically designed system of governance within a business, a charity, or whatever. A second issue, but it sort of is ownership, having sort of horizontal ownership versus just having sort of so when you say a worker-owned co-op and you want to have all the workers contribute to it, that's fine. There actually are successful worker-owned co-ops. There are actually horizontal organizations that exist, like Steam, the video game company. No one's in charge of anybody there. Basically, like every hiring decision is made as sort of a group. And once you become part of the staff, you kind of just do whatever you want. And basically, as long as everyone feels that you're like doing something that helps, that's productive, everyone kind of keeps you around and will agree to give you a raise or agree to get rid of you if you're not. Okay, but these are generally smaller groups, and they're generally higher specialization type areas that are able to actually pull this off, mainly because people who are higher specialized probably have a better ability of assessing each other, holding each other accountable, and be better able to delegate a more specific division of labor. Now, I guess there are also factories, farmer co-ops, stuff like that, and then they can work in certain situations. Now, if you take a look at your traditional enterprise, I don't think like early stage startups are oftentimes good as a co-op, because mainly it's just basically what's going to happen is that a lot of times your initial staff isn't going to want to take the risk of the startup, and at the same time, oftentimes they're not going to have the capital to put up to start a co-op. Like really, if you wanted to start like a workers co-op that was a startup business, you would really need a bunch of people who are willing to put up a little bit of money, which this does sometimes happen, where basically a bunch of people who work for one company get together and pool their savings to start a competing company that's sort of worker owned. A lot of times those end up evolving over time into more vertical types of organizations, just because in a more competitive market, you need to be able to make decisions quicker. You need to have clear chains of accountability. So the more competitive a market is, the more need there is for that horizontal chain. Okay. So I think as an industry grows and a market, so basically what happens generally when you have a new industry, there's going to be lots of startups, a lot of competing startups, a lot of competition. You're going to have a lot of startups. You're going to have a lot of failures. During that period of time, you're probably better off with, people putting up money. They're investing in an enterprise. They're going to have a lot of control over their investment, and everything's going to be sort of very vertical. But as an industry hits later stages in its life, and its growth potential isn't necessarily great, but it has a consistent profit potential. Typically, what would happen is that the company would just become an income-paying stock per se as a public company. But I think there is room. I think if there's someone someone who designs financial products, a financial engineer, I think there is a opening for designing a way to create a financing mechanism to allow buyouts by employees, in the sense that, facilitate the employees being able to pool the funds together to do a buyout of a sort of a later stage firm. Because at that point, I do think, sort of the same type of basically different investors have different goals. At that point, your traditional sort of ownership or the different kind of investors you would have maybe are not necessarily the right investors, the people whose goals aren't necessarily lined up with the life cycle of the firm at the time. So it may be possible, and I think in many cases it may be better off. There might be some benefit that it being more worker owned, more worker involvement. Okay, and that can be done through, again, just creating an interesting financial mechanism somehow, so that way workers can come together and put up and be able to raise the money and basically buy out the firm. Okay, so again, no one's taking anything from anybody, no one's doing anything involuntary. You're just coming up with a financially innovative product that helps facilitate a later stage company to become in control of its long-time employees, instead of being sort of subject to the same growth-driven market whims. Which I think those are very good for early stage industries. And again, this is totally opinion, and markets will figure out if this is sort of what should be done or shouldn't be done. The market will decide. But there are successful horizontal organizations, so there are situations in which they do apply and reasons why they may work. But I think, again, like anything else, different situations demand different differences. But I do think having a conversation about governance and learning about governance and learning about the differences in governance results between different situations is a conversation libertarians should be willing to have. And it's actually a very interesting one and a very enriching one, I find. So hopefully you guys found this interesting. Again, this is the AlexMercedCast. If you guys enjoy the show, feel free to become a patron over there at patreon.com/AlexMerced, or you can go to donate.alexmerced.com and find ways to help support my efforts. And hopefully you guys found this thought-provoking and whatnot. I will talk to you guys soon, and you guys have a good one.
Thank you for listening to the Alex Merced Cast. Learn more at AlexMerced.com, Libertarian101.com, and LibertarianWingedMedia.com. Follow Alex Merced on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook.